Hello, Alex. Thanks for joining me for this conversation.
Hello, thank you for having me, Alexia. It's always wonderful to chat.
Yeah, now we're going to be talking all about trauma today, and in a kind of hopefully in a very light and positive way, and not necessarily in a kind of depressing manner. Or so I want those listening to kind of not think, oh, trauma, I'm not going to listen to this. Because actually, there's a different perspective on trauma that I'd like us to kind of explore today, if that's okay. But before we do all that, would you mind just sort of telling us a little bit about who you are and how come I'm talking to you about trauma?
Of course. So yeah, I'm Alex. I'm Alex Heath, and I'm a hypnotherapist by trade. That's my training, and I've been a hypnotherapist for about 12, 13 years now. But when I trained to be a hypnotherapist, I was working a lot with parents. So I ended up supporting them with a whole range of different things. And although I actually had very positive birth experiences myself, because I was supporting parents as a hypnotherapist, I was really shocked to discover there was so much birth trauma out there. So I really began sort of honing some skills and techniques as a process, a definite process that could be used by parents to free them from trauma symptoms that they were experiencing. And then I started to teach that process to other birth professionals, because sadly it's just so many parents 30% of all parents describe their birth as a traumatic event. And as a parent yourself, you know how difficult it is postnatally in that first year of a child's life, just getting through it. It's even harder if you've got trauma that you're trying to process or cope with at the same time. And that's the reality for a lot of parents. And often it impacts in all kinds of areas. It impacts on relationships, on intimacy, on bonding, on feeding, on recovery, but also on people's hopes for the future as well. So there was a real need for this, and there was a real need to share this way of working with lots of other people, which is what I've done ultimately. So now that has expanded, and we're not just about birth trauma, but we're about acknowledging all different kinds of perinatal trauma, from miscarriage and baby loss to all of the traumas, really. Birth injury, which is a huge taboo, especially in the UK. That's not to say, isn't it, France, but I just think France have got a very unique perspective on pelvic floor health, which is to be applauded, as a little aside there. But it considers all of the different types of perinatal trauma that parents experience, which are actually quite many. Many parents experience difficulties with fertility, difficulties with trying to conceive. And there's a lot, the whole perinatal period is fraught with loss and grief, as well as trauma. And so it's about sharing some of the techniques that I know from the modalities of hypnosis, mindfulness and meditation that can be so transformative to parents, and that actually we're just sharing with parents that they can begin to adopt and use themselves. So they're real life skills that we're sharing. So that's what I do now, all under the umbrella of TBR College, which is an organisation that teaches and trains perinatal professionals in these skills. So yeah, that's me.
That's brilliant and wonderful. So when you're talking about when you're working with parents and the trauma, because I know the one thing that a lot of women, you mentioned 30% of births are experienced as birth trauma. And I know we've had a previous conversation already about birth trauma on my other podcast, the Fear-Free Childbirth podcast. So for those listening, watching, if you want to listen to a sort of conversation all about birth trauma, then the Fear-Free Childbirth's got a conversation with myself and Alex that we had a few years ago now, wasn't it?
Yes.
But it is a huge number of, think about how many births that is and how many women and families. It's not just the women, but the fathers also get, just observing what's going on can be incredibly traumatic for the families. And as you say, sort of be able to handle that. So at what point during that process do you find is most optimal for them to sort of start seeking support and help on their traumatic experiences?
Yeah, it's really it's different for everyone. So, some people have an experience of very traumatic birth, but they might go home from hospital and they are surrounded by, really good love and care. And love and support and care is really the antidote for trauma. We need to stand down our nervous system, and we need to feel safe again in order to be able to process what has happened and to readjust. And that seems to make a difference to how some people are able to come away from trauma with no residual trauma symptoms, and why some people aren't. And I think the problem is with a postnatal experience, and why sometimes people don't recover from birth trauma, is because they're straight back into the maelstrom of having to care for a baby. Now, caring for a baby physiologically requires that we are in that loving state, because we require oxytocin, prolactin, all of the hormones that really need us to feel safe in order to flow. And those hormones are needed for good feeding, bonding, sleeping, recovery. Now, if we're stuck in fight or flight, the sympathetic mode, because of trauma, then literally our bodies are coursing with adrenaline and cortisol after trauma. So unless that's able to readjust, unless the autonomic nervous system is able to come into a relaxed state where those other hormones are going to flow, then it often means that the parents coming out of a traumatic birth are then hit with a traumatic postnatal period. Difficulty with feeding, difficulty with sleeping, difficulty bonding, difficulty recovering, high anxiety, leading perhaps to depression. And a lot of postnatal depression, I feel, is misdiagnosed birth trauma. Very often, I've supported parents with postnatal depression. Actually, when you talk to them, you hear, geez, really went through a really lot of difficult stuff that's just not being acknowledged. No wonder you feel low in mood and are struggling to cope, because you've actually been through something really hard. And so it's having that acknowledgement about how trauma can then go on to impact our lives, depending on where we are in our life stage, right? Because becoming a parent is a very particular life stage where we're thrown into lots of other challenges. So we really need to be in top condition for it, both physically, mentally, emotionally, and everything else. And trauma leaves us on in a low par, and so sometimes parents will go on to struggle in that way after a traumatic birth. Other times parents will recover, but it's when they start thinking about getting pregnant again, or when they are pregnant again, that a lot of those trauma symptoms are re-triggered, and fear builds every day of the pregnancy until it becomes intolerable, until they're experiencing panic attacks, until they can't go to their antenatal appointments, things like that. Or requesting elective cesareans, or just really having a lot of fear, because the bad thing that happened is looming large again. So it impacts parents, I would say, in all of those different ways, really, and at different times, which I think has made it difficult for healthcare professionals to really appreciate the causal link between how we give birth and how we feel in that postnatal period. Because, of course, the person looking after us at birth isn't necessarily the person that's there in that year afterwards. So, there's not a lot of joining up the dots. It's like, this stuff matters because it will affect us for a long time afterwards, So that's my view on how one thing affects the other thing affects the other thing.
Well, in talking about trauma, because one of the things I specialised in as part of my birth work was in tocophobia, which is the extreme fear of birth and pregnancy. And there's two types of tocophobia. There's primary tocophobia and secondary tocophobia. And secondary tocophobia comes as a result of a previous birth experience of the woman. So everything you just described sounds like secondary tocophobia, where you've got a trauma at the root that's feeding the fear, and it's really causing a lot of challenges to the woman going back into her pregnancy and birth experiences. Whereas the primary tocophobia is where there isn't a previous birth experience. And when I say previous birth experience, I mean the woman having had a giving birth experience. But actually there is a previous birth experience. It's her own birthing. It's her own arrival in the world. And that's what I found from all the work that I've done with women, is when we clear the trauma of their own birth, a lot of the fears collapse in a way, in the same way that it would do with secondary tocophobia. It's just a lot of people aren't awake to the fact that their own birth could be the root trauma here that's reawakening all of those fears. And so, and it also happens a lot in the dads and the men, because they too have been born, it's not just a female. We think of like these birth trauma experiences as being a female challenge, but actually because we've all had to arrive in the world somehow. I've heard so many stories.
We've all had an original experience
that can't be in that birth space, because it's bringing everything up for them. I hired a videographer once to do some content for me, and after about 5 minutes of me talking about birth, he's like, I gotta stop, I'm gonna faint. He couldn't handle me talking about it. He was 19. He didn't even have a relationship, like he couldn't handle that, and that was clearly the source of all that. So I think this acknowledgement that trauma can be at the root of so many fears that show up for us today, that we don't always know what that root experience was. I think for some of the stuff that you're describing, it's really obvious for the family involved. Oh, well, that first birth was difficult. And we can point the finger at that, and we can go and seek support for that and go, okay, and seek the professional support to help us through that. But I think a lot of people are wrestling today with traumatic experiences they don't have any conscious memory of. Yeah. And it leaves them feeling that one thing I find with the women with tocophobia is they're like, it doesn't make sense why I feel this way. And that can, this helplessness or like not knowing why they feel this way. And they think therefore that when I had tocophobia, I thought I was crazy. I thought I was like, what the hell is going on with me? You need help, but there was nothing, it didn't make sense why I felt that way. And that can add a whole other layer of angst, of anxiety, of stuff. Whereas if you go, oh, it's because of my own, but right, okay, I'm not crazy. It's what's happened to me that is making you feel that way. And so it's these unknown events that I think,
it's the hidden memories. It's the hidden memories that are still encoded with feeling that when they're triggered cause you to respond viscerally to save your life, basically, because it's our reptilian brain. It's not going to compute the whys or the wherefores, which is why our logical brain can't understand it. Our logical brain's scrambling for an answer, going, why? But it's nothing to do with our logical, our higher brain. It's a very primitive response to something that happened long ago that was threatening to your very life, to your very existence. And so that's why it promotes that response, because it's telling you to get out, to run away, or to avoid it completely. And I think avoidance is a trauma symptom that in itself, and so it's not often discussed in that way. I mean, that's another reason, as well as memories being unconscious, that we have that unconscious thing, but avoidance is also a trauma symptom. We will do almost anything to avoid being reminded of, being near a similar stimulus, because we just don't want that kind of, force field around that event to be triggered. And so, they're all natural responses, but eventually they end up we can only kind of avoid things for so long before we kind of end up at a stage in our life where we go, we haven't got the things that we want, or we're not doing the things that we want, or we're not having the experiences or the relationships that we want because we're just too avoidant of all of these things. So it can end up being a very limited life if we don't confront the things that are driving our behaviour.
So there's two things I want to ask you, but I'm going to go with symptoms first. So, and the other thing I'm going to ask you is the way out of that. So let's go to symptoms. You mentioned avoidance as a trauma symptom. So what other symptoms are telltale trauma symptoms?
So the symptoms that I think most people commonly kind of go, oh yeah, that's PTSD, or they really, that people kind of go, oh yeah, we've seen it. It's really common, that things that are really commonly used as dramatic devices actually in films or stuff you see on TV are things like flashbacks or nightmares. And pretty much all of us have probably had that experience of where we've kind of been taken back to something and thought, even if it's just that it's a memory that has come to us inappropriately or something. So there's a whole section of symptoms that fall under the category of re-experiencing, and those are that kind of being on loop. So they include things like nightmares, things like recurrent thinking about what happened. So if you ever had something that's maybe not traumatic but difficult, and you play it over and over and over and over, and an argument with somebody, and you go over and over and over and over and over it, trying to, so recurrent thinking, recurrent dreams, nightmares, and the anxiety that comes up when you think about those things. So those are the recurrent symptoms. Then there are symptoms of avoidance, and those are, as would suggest, just doing anything to avoid. I mean, your videographer would have been an example of that. He was just like, I can't do it. I've got to quit. It just really does not want any reminders, but doesn't even really understand why, but just knows it. Does not want to go near the bad thing. And so it's just really avoidant. And for a parent, that's probably a parent who's avoiding all mother and baby groups, is avoiding hospital appointments, perhaps, is avoiding future pregnancies. And that actually means avoiding intimacy as well.
Oh, gotcha.
Scared of where that might lead. So avoidance can cover a whole range, impact someone's day-to-day life in a whole range of different ways. But it can also mean things like a detachment from others, a sort of feeling of sadness about what happened as well, and a numbness about what happened. So sort of almost that kind of dissociation,
Mm.
going in towards that dissociation of like really not wanting to think about it, so just putting it in a box where it doesn't engage any feeling, you know. So those are feelings of avoidance. And then there's arousal symptoms, and those are things like anger, hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is a massive one for parents that often is explained away as a new parent thing, but actually, you know, if we were to ask some parents, you know, how was your birth, or did you have a good birth, and you probably find that maybe their hypervigilance, which can tip over to a real anxieties about health, you know, and anxiety is just generally about leaving a child with someone else, which is problematic. You know, if you ever want to go out and do anything on your own at some point in your journey as a parent. So those are experiences of, you know, difficulty concentrating, irritability would be under those kinds of overstimulated symptoms. And then there's mood and cognition, and those are things like feeling bad about the self, feeling guilt, feeling blame, you know, loss of interest in things that were interesting or did used to provide pleasure to a person. So luckily now there is a birth trauma scale which has these different categories, which are slightly different and more nuanced for perinatal trauma than what the general DSM PTSD criteria was, which was very rigid, had 3 categories, and was a lot of symptoms and a lot of duration. So now there is more consideration that birth trauma is a thing, and it's a very nuanced experience that is different from other kinds of trauma. It's different from a vet returning from a war zone. It's different from somebody involved in a natural disaster, or even somebody involved in, you know, a motorway accident or something like that. You know, it's a very nuanced type of trauma because it involves someone else, you know, your baby, and a real threat to physical integrity, as well as emotional kind of integrity too.
No, the birth experience, all of that, I think, with the tocophobia work and the anxiety work that's tied into birth and helping women to prepare for those birth experiences, is very unique to that whole journey that they're going on. That I think is not easily, you can't just take some kind of toolkit from elsewhere and just think that's going to work for birth, because I think you need to really take on board the nuances that are going on and the journey, the uniqueness of that journey, the way that the body and mind is all as one, and there's another being that's connected. I mean, that just makes it such a unique, that deserves its own, you know, people looking at its own thing. It deserves its own thing. Exactly.
And also, exactly as you described earlier, there's also this phenomenon with birth trauma that it's generationally passed on. So we do see in parents that there is this phenomena that, you know, women who have birth trauma often have children who grow up to be adults who are then tocophobic or fearful of birth. And in a very basic way, you know, generational trauma is passed on through the line just by our experiences as children. So, you know, then when we become parents ourselves, that stuff's triggered, you know, and we consider that 25% of all women are survivors of some kind of abuse. That will be re-triggered, and yet, you know, vaginal examinations are part of the maternity experience. Now that will be very, very triggering and traumatizing to somebody who is a survivor, and that's a quarter of all women. You know, I mean, it's the system that's wrong, not the...
Absolutely. And I think with the ancestral trauma is also a lot of the traumatic memories are within our very cells. So when you've got ancestral, if the mother or the grandmother, and you think about what the generations before us, when they would have been giving birth in war environments, or, you know, what kind of memories do we have within ourselves that are getting triggered? And then there's also the language, the stories we grow up hearing about, oh, well, no, because of you, I can't go to the toilet now, or because of you, I can't have, you know, all that kind of guilt that's laid on by the mother or the grandmother, and the chats around family chats. So you've got the kind of the conscious stuff they would have heard talked about, and the memories within their cells that they can't even explain because it's just who they are. So this perpetuation of difficult birth does have you know, you can kind of stop the cycle. The woman who says, this is going to stop with me. I'm going to heal all my shit now because I don't want this to carry on any further. I'm going to stop this one in my tracks to prevent it from going any further down the maternal line. You can do that, but that takes a certain kind of person that's going to go, hey, I'm going to look at this head on and deal with it to try and prevent this going forward. Whereas a lot of women do enter that birth, that pregnancy journey without much of an understanding of that, because we're not educated around that. We don't know about a lot of that, and a lot of fear does come to women because they simply don't have a lot of an understanding about that whole process. And so when you lay on the lack of knowledge and the lack of information, the lack of understanding, plus the inherent trauma that they're carrying within, plus the stories, plus the media and film,
and the system as well. The system is traumatizing, you know, more so than ever before, because it's underfunded and there's not enough people in it, and the people working in it are traumatized as well.
Totally.
You need a really safe environment to give birth, and in my view, hospitals aren't often a safe environment. They don't feel safe to people. So you go into an environment not feeling safe, the chances are the outcome will be quite difficult. It will be quite scary and frightening, and those are the magic ingredients for trauma. So it is a wonder how good birth happens, but it does happen.
Oh, absolutely.
I remind myself that I did have good births, but I have definitely outstripped that now vicariously through hearing so many awful births.
Yeah. Now, one of the things you mentioned earlier was people putting things in a box and kind of burying it a little bit, disassociating from that. So, and also you can only avoid things for so long. So at some point, we will be called to face our traumas and open the box. So when that time comes, I know there's a lot of people that are really worried about what they're, you know, I've heard the thing, I don't want to open Pandora's box, and that Pandora's box is used a lot around this, because they just feel that the minute they crack it open, the lid a little bit, it's just going to be this huge awful thing that's just going to engulf them, and they're going to be out of action for months, and it's just going to be debilitating and all of that. So can we just talk a little bit about what that process of really going, okay, I'm going to pick up the box now and I'm going to prise it open, and what can that look like? Because I think a lot of people aren't going there because they're so fearful of the process of letting go of trauma.
Exactly.
And it doesn't have to be that way, in my experience anyway, but I want you to talk about what your views on that are.
Well, I think it's a really worthwhile question to ask and to discuss, because most people don't seek trauma for the bad things that happen to them. They kind of habituate that pain and they sort of carry it around like a heavy bag, and it affects their posture, and they'll get referred pain somewhere else because they're carrying around all this crap from the past. And actually, very often, and I say we'll all do this to some extent at some point in our lives, we will live our lives as if we were living the past event, the past trauma, you know, and so we'll be avoiding things, we'll be showing up in a certain way, we'll be relating to other people, but more importantly, the way we relate to ourselves affects the way that we are in the world. And so there's a lot to be gained from freeing ourselves from past events, because it really allows us to have the space to go forward towards something new. The problem is that in the past, we've had quite a kind of myopic or one track option for therapy and for dealing with trauma. And a lot of that has been talking therapy. Or CBT, and so really talking, revisiting the bad thing that happened over and over and over again is just like rehearsing the patterns of trauma over and over again. We're just remembering, re-experiencing the feeling, and then responding the same. Remembering, feeling, responding the same. And the more that we remember it, the more the pattern stays well worn into our neurocircuitry. And so really talking endlessly about the bad thing that happened is never going to change that circuitry or that patterning. We need to break the pattern in order to create space for something new. And that isn't talking. Talking therapy won't do that. Talking therapy is just rehearsing what has been before. So if you are looking to overcome bad stuff that's happened, go and seek out somebody who has those skills, is a trauma specializing therapist. It might be that they're a hypnotherapist, it might be that they're a psychotherapist. It might be that they have EMDR or IEMT or rewind, some exercise, or head trash clearance, some exercise that clears away the patterning of trauma, because it's a pattern that just gets on a loop, on a loop, on a loop. And when you've done that, you create space, and the space should feel expansive. It should feel like freedom. It should feel like peace. It should feel like opportunity. It should feel like, okay, if I could choose now, what am I going to choose? And this is the other skill set that any kind of therapist or support person that's helping someone recover from trauma should have. They should be able to say, well, what's it going to look like? What's it going to feel like? How are you going to know when those things have gone? You know, so we can very quickly feel that space with the new, you know, with the new pattern, with the desired response, with the desired feelings, and we can begin rehearsing those over and over and over again. And in that way, it's actually a really beautiful, simple, you know, people get very traumatized by the word trauma, and and obviously we do need to take care when supporting people with trauma, but it doesn't need to be a lengthy process. And it's true that not all trauma is linear. The only thing I would say is that treatment for trauma is not a forever thing. You can easily still be re-triggered. You always have to be mindful of your stuff. After treatment, people usually go out and feel like this epiphany and energy, and, you know, do all this new stuff, make huge leaps and bounds in relationships and life and everything. But then life happens, right? Shit happens. And life has a way of teaching us the same lessons over and over again and re-triggering stuff. And you're like, it's a bit like what you were saying about hunting out where's the stuff? What's it? That stuff still happens. You know, you can have trauma therapy and you can still be re-triggered. You'll just need more support with that particular trauma. But it doesn't, exactly as you said, it doesn't need to be lengthy. It certainly should not be years. It shouldn't even really be months. No. You know, it should be supported by exercises that you can use yourself, which I know yours can and mine can. Yeah. And it should really guide you towards your desired state. And that's the thing. Once we start thinking about the good stuff, then we're already starting to create our solution, our healing, our good place, aren't we?
Yeah. No, because I firmly believe that one, it doesn't take a lot of time to get rid of some of this stuff. What I found with my fear clearance work is that some people, you know, people ask me, how long does it take to get rid of fears using head trash clearance? And so one clearance, for those listening, you know, if you want to clear a fear of injections or spiders, that's just one clearance. And so, but I had a phobia of needles and injections where I would collapse at the sight of a needle every time. So I was always carried out of a doctor's surgery. So that's a fairly intense, fear. That wasn't just, I would just pass out. And I was able to clear that in under 5 minutes. So that was really intense. But some other things that I've had to work on, I've had to spend an hour clearing it. And I'm like, well, why did that take so long? So it's not always the strength of the thing. It's how much trapped emotional energy we're carrying around this. It's like, you know, how long is it going to take to empty that bucket? Well, is it a little bucket or is it a massive bucket? Like, well, we don't know until we start digging, until we start doing the clearance. We don't know how long that's going to take. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean I'm going to be clearing something for weeks and weeks and weeks. It can be done. So an abortion trauma or, you know, abuse trauma or a birth trauma, that kind of stuff can happen in 1 or 2 sittings, really. Depends on how many facets or how many different experiences are into it. That's my experience anyway. And then you can start doing the rebuild or the little tidying around the edges, because as a result of these traumas, we've put some meanings in place. Yes. We've gone, oh, well, because of this, therefore the world is like this. I can't do this. I must be this person. So it's the trauma's the root, and then there's all these little branches that grow off. That are the beliefs and the patterns and the ways that
make it mean what we make
the meanings. Exactly. So once you've taken the roots away, sometimes you need to just look at the branches and go, hang on a minute, we just need to kind of like acknowledge and say that meanings doesn't stand anymore. There's nothing to support that meaning. So I built that on the trauma, and actually the trauma isn't there. So what does life mean now? And that's not the trauma work, but that's essential to kind of
it is really
wrap it up in a bow. Do you know what I mean? If you want to fully let go of that trauma, you need to look at all the little patterns that spin off it.
I
And
think the beliefs are really important, because I think sometimes if we maintain the belief, so for example, if we maintain the belief, well, bad things always happen to me, or people are always taking advantage of me, and that's why I had this trauma. If you clear trauma and that belief still remains, then you can head towards another trauma that affirms that belief.
exactly.
And so I think the beliefs are really important to work with, and certainly an important aspect of what the work that I do too is really listening out. I'm always listening to hear how that person understands their problem. It's not how I understand it, because that's not going to be the thing. But if I can understand their beliefs, their way of thinking, their way of feeling about it, which always come out in the language that people use to describe their experience, then you can just use that to understand what it's going to be like without that. And it's just understanding what's without that, what is that like? Without that, what is that like? You know, it's a very odd way of thinking, but we often think it's really complex, but sometimes we just need to consider what the absence of the thing is going to feel like.
Yeah. And I don't think it's as complex. There's a lot of talk about complex trauma, and it's difficult, and you've got to, you know, and making it sound like this really complex thing that you need to be super, you know, trained for 7 years to do it and all that. And actually, it doesn't need to be that complicated. It can be incredibly simple and incredibly graceful. And it can be, you can let go of this stuff very quickly, in my experience, as long as you're kind of working with the, knowing that there are the beliefs hooked in and all these little bits. And actually, and it can be, people can let go of this stuff, in my experience at least, very, very quickly. And also what I've not witnessed, and again, I'd be interested in what your experience is, because you've worked with different types of trauma than what I've worked with, is that when they do open Pandora's box, it rarely is this big calamity of a life that then ensues for 3 months. It's, you might have a very tearful, sobbing, emotional session as you're letting go of the shit, right? But then at the end of that, you're feeling maybe tired, exhausted, but light. And a bit like,
absolutely, the light.
I can breathe again. Oh my goodness, I feel so much better for letting that go.
You see postural changes in people.
Totally.
Like they came in like that, and they leave sort of.
Exactly. Totally. And
that change, you know.
And I think a lot of people are fearful of and I saw this a lot in my birth work, of losing control. Losing control is a fear for many people anyway. So they've got to be in control of everything in the house or whatever, or the car or the whatever, but actually losing control of their emotions and their emotional state. So what happens if I start crying? Will it be uncontrollable sobbing? Will I ever stop crying? And how will will that turn into an anxiety attack? Will that turn into me being depressed and not be able to get out of bed? Where does that emotional release end? And if I can't rein it in, and that seems to be a huge fear. You're nodding a lot for those that are just listening. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm listening to you, what I'm thinking is that what you're describing sounds to me like those of us who have a fear of our feelings and have a fear of our anxiety. So it's like a meta anxiety. It's an anxiety about anxiety. It's like, I can't cope with the copingness.
It's called
I can't cope with the thing. Whenever I hear that and I'm like, I can't cope with it, I can't cope, it's too much for me, I can't deal with it, I need to keep it over there. A fear around fear, or a fear around difficult feelings, or a fear around losing control, it's all anxiety, but it's anxiety that's been ratcheted up a level. So it's anxiety about the anxiety. So it's basically a fear about coping. That is when I hear that fear about coping, I'm always like, that's just huge anxiety. And I think this is, for me, because the anxiety work is also separate from trauma work, but also like intrinsically interwoven with it. It's you were talking, Alexia, about, you know, how lots of people are just unconscious of their traumas. For me, what I see a lot of is how people are unconscious of their anxiety. They're just really unaware that what they're experiencing is fear. And actually, when they say they can't cope, they can't bear to look at it, or they, you know, then they're not sure whether it's a fear about fear. You're fearing fear, and it's like, that's when we know you've got to dial it. It's anxiety. We need a name for it. It needs to be recognized, it needs to be acknowledged, and it needs to be managed, you know, because otherwise, when you start to fear, when you start to think that you can't cope with fear, to me as a therapist, you're very vulnerable to breakdowns. You're very vulnerable to more serious anxiety disorders like OCDs, addictions, things that are tricky. Like when someone comes to see me as a therapist with trauma, I'm like, oh, brilliant. That's probably 3 sessions. And
easy.
Somebody comes in front of me and they've got an addiction problem or OCD. I'm like, well, that's going to take longer, because that's the result of not dealing with it. To me, that's where it goes. It goes to an OCD. It goes to addiction, or things that are actually harder to unwind, because there's a huge behavioral element to that. There's so much value, and a lot of anxiety does come from trauma. There's so much value from opening the Pandora's box and knowing that you can cope with it. And a lot of that is about having a conversation with yourself. I think so much of what we're talking about is about re-engaging people with themselves in a really positive way. When we go through bad shit, we tend to blame ourselves, and we tend to have these negative conversations about who we are, what we can cope with, and our hopes for the future. We tend to get a massive downer on ourselves when we experience things that largely aren't our fault. We were either born into them, or it happened at the hands of the system, or whatever, yet we feel somehow we're to blame. And so that's when the stories and the beliefs come, right? But actually, when we know more about why the mind is responding in the way it is, and anxiety is a symptom of trauma, then we can begin to work with it. We can begin to manage it. And it can actually, I do believe anxiety can be a superpower. I mean, it's how you came to have the life that you are having right now, is because you were incredibly anxious about birth.
No, I know. I'm so grateful that in the face of my own tocophobia when I was pregnant. So for those that don't know, I first started, I had tocophobia without realizing it. And that led me to develop my technique to clear my own fears, which led to a whole new body of work around birth and working with tocophobia. And when I realized it was so effective at clearing fears, I just kept, because it got a little bit addictive, I have to say. When the first time I tested it on my fear of injections, and I was like, oh my God, I'm still sitting upright in the doctor's thing with having an injection. I've seen the end of it. Normally I'm on the floor being dragged out at this point. I can use this on all my other stuff. And I just went crazy, writing all my fears down. And I cleared my tocophobia in under 2 months while I was pregnant, which apparently is unheard of. It was back then. And then I've just kept going.
It's a very tricky phobia to shift.
For some when people. You know what you're doing, it's actually I can now it's very straight. I think it's incredibly, it's almost predictable. I can predict what things my clients are going to need. And 80% of tocophobia clients, I think, will all need to clear the same fears. Then there's a little 20-30% that's probably unique to their own, what's going on for them, because it can branch out. But it is, but I've got a good understanding of it because I had it, and I've been unraveling it and working with it for nearly 8 years now. But that kind of the transformation I was able, when I was like, oh, C-section with all the drugs, please, in month 3, to like, I'm going to have a home birth in month 7, and I had an amazing home birth. What a turnaround that was for me when I thought I didn't want to be conscious of this birth, that I just thought I'm going to hunt down every other nightmare in my head, because what else is waiting for me in life if I've managed to bring about this transformation? And I have done. And fast forward, I think the last time we spoke, I was living a life I didn't quite enjoy in the Midlands in the UK. And here I am now living in the south of France, the dream life that actually and forced me to confront so many fears and things and uncertainty and all of that. But having the tools and the ability to be able to heal my shit, hunt down my traumas, enabled that to happen. And so I would encourage people to hunt down their stuff. And I'm relentless with it. I'm like, oh my God, why did I get triggered there? What's going on? There's a trauma. Is it a trauma? What is it? I need to get rid of that. Don't want that thing.
I can tell.
Bring it on.
Into it all the time.
And I love it. I'm not fearful of my stuff. And I work really well with people who are at that kind of mindset. They want to hunt down their stuff too, and really kind of be a better version of themselves. What's happened there?
Oh, I don't know. I'm still here.
Oh no! Oh yeah, no. My Evernote decided to do an update. You disappeared. So for those people that kind of are worried about their stuff, I call it head trash, is actually one. It doesn't have to be this big kind of scary ongoing experience. I think, in my experience, at least, the moment that you're sitting down with somebody or on your own to clear something traumatic, that can be tearful and emotional. But then it gets calm down to the end and you come to an end of that, and then you process it, and then you work on to the next one. And depending on how far you want to sort of pull the thread, as it were, you know, some people want to, okay, I have my birth trauma experience and I really want to let go of that, or as a specific known thing. And that, you know, you go, okay, well, that there's that aspect to that, there was that part of the experience, and we, you know, you mentioned 3 sessions, so you need to kind of identify all those aspects. But what I found really interesting is how these unknown traumas are behind some of these things that we don't know why we're behaving the way we do. So I did a lot of work with business owners, female business owners, around visibility and confidence during the pandemic. And what was really interesting to me, these are like CEOs, you know, lots of employees, 6-7-figure businesses. And we were working on visibility and speaking up, and working in a male dominated industry, that kind of thing. And we were working on visibility thing. And then memories were coming up, and there's a pattern to all the memories that were coming up. And they all had memories of playing hide and seek and having a crappy hide and seek experience as a kid.
Not being found,
not being hidden, being quiet, playing small. So basically they were so they have this imprint of patterns from playing hide and seek at 5 or 7, and they're still using the rules of hide and seek today. They're trying to be a thought leader and a CEO and visible. And because they were left in the washing basket or left in the cupboard by an older brother who thought it'd be hilarious. And for them to, if you think about that, oh, well, if I speak up, I'll lose because it's breaking the rules and I'm a good girl. You know, so all of that, you think all of that that's embedded. Now, how many other...
What a shit game it is when you think about it.
It's terrible. It's really bad, right? It's really bad. But no one would think, oh, yeah, hide and seek, that's a trauma. You wouldn't go to your therapist and go, my hide and seek trauma, because nobody would think that was a trauma.
But it's how we learn as children. It's how, you know, we learn through play, and we learn a lot of social codes and conducts and morals and, you know, values about how to be, particularly girls who have to kind of always shapeshift to be accepted and protected, I think.
But how many other experiences like the hide and seek experiences do we all have that we're not even acknowledging?
Well, and someone told me a good one the other day, and this is about owning your desires. So this is something that I do with some of my students and practitioners. Is like, if you can't own what you desire, then you're probably never going to get there, and you just end up getting frustrated that you're not getting things that you want. But have you actually named the thing that you desire? And so many women really find it hard to say, well, I want to have, you know, a business that pays me this much a month, or I want to have, you know, I don't know, a sports car in my driveway, or I want to have, you know, whatever the thing is that they want. I find it hard to say out aloud, that's the thing that I want. And somebody said, because when you're younger, you're told to blow out the candle and make a wish, but don't tell anyone, otherwise it won't come true. Wow. And that's another way of understanding as a child, don't brag about your desires. Because if you brag about your desires, if you brag about your wishes, they won't come true. Keep them a secret, keep them hidden. And obviously, if there's something to be hidden, then it's something that's not right.
Yeah, so parents everywhere are going, oh my God, I'm traumatizing my kids.
But it's all of these, there's really weird rituals and play that we have around children, actually, that you know, must be like laying down those kinds of stories that sort of say, stay hidden, or, you know, wait to be found, wait to be discovered.
Exactly.
Don't share your wishes. Don't speak up what your desires are.
I was listening to somebody else who said that, you know, one of some key wounds around certain aspects of your life, and one of them is the asking wound. And I was like, okay. So I was like, okay, I'm going to clear my traumas around asking. And when I sat there thinking about my traumas around asking, I was like, well, that doesn't feel like a very traumatic thing for me, asking. And I test in for how many traumas you've got around certain aspects of your life. And I look into past life and whether they're ancestral stuff, and go back to see how much we're carrying within our field, within the human being that we are today, that we're brought forward from other lives and ancestors, and also our time in utero, because that's also a very important time for us. In utero. And I, through my own inquiry, I found that there was really not a lot in my actual life as a human outside of the womb. it was all in my ancestral line and mainly in past life. I was like, all this clearance is going to be a doddle because I've got nothing really. And I spent the next hour crying my eyes out, thinking, what the hell? And yeah, the traumas around asking, and you would never think, you know, because I've gone into pursuing hunting down the traumas around themes in our life, because they all all these little micro moments of trauma kind of all line up behind certain themes where we can't handle rejection, we can't handle, or we've had abandonment issues, or and these themes where we can't point to an event. We go, oh, well, the reason I'm like that is because of X, Y, Z. It's actually, there's hundreds of events that you've had that together mean that asking is now a problem for you, or receiving is a problem for you. And actually clearing the stuff by theme. I've found that I've been doing that. I've been hunting down themes in my own life relentlessly the last 6 months. And oh my God, how interesting is that? And the transformations I've experienced as a result of hunting traumas down by theme has been phenomenal. And also what's fun, it's not fun. I think trauma clearance is fun. And I've got people in my tribe when I'm running trauma clearances like, oh, I can't wait for this trauma clearance this Friday. They're like really excited about it. I'm like, I love your spirit. But it is kind of fun because you do kind of get a memory pop up during these clearances where you go, oh my goodness, yes. And suddenly there's something that you can consciously remember that makes you go, that's why I'm behaving like that. And that kind of insight can be really all you need to make this little quantum leap, a connection.
And when you're working with yourself on your own head clearance, Lexia, because that's the thing that I think is really cool about your process. I mean, you can rewind yourself, but actually there's always a benefit to somebody guiding you and sort of saying, it's really investigating what the change is going to be when that's gone. How do you guide yourself through that? Is that like a meditative process that you go through where you've cleared it and then you simply allow yourself to experience the change that has occurred as releasing that, or how does that part of it work?
It's mantra based, so you kind of repeat certain mantras to yourself so it goes through layers. And as I've been testing and exploring it, then I come up with new mantras as I'm doing it myself, and I note the release that I'm getting from that, and I also muscle test into that to see whether there is anything within that it needs work, I actually need to use that on myself. And then at the end I always work on it. The head trash clearance method is based on opposites, so there's always an opposite, and the opposite is usually the good. Not the good, nothing is good and bad. But the opposite, you know, if you're thinking about abandonment trauma, the opposite of that is being cherished, adored, sought out. So naturally the technique invites you to then go to it, which is then plugging the gap, which is the desire, the want, so it kind of ties it in a bow on its the process is very bow tying in that respect. Does that make sense? So so I'm I'm very keen that a lot of my methods, there's always a DIY version, even though there's a practitioner.
I like that. I always like people to learn what they're going through. It's because then it has even more value, doesn't it? As people can do it.
I think if you can clear your own stuff, it's great to get guidance. And if you've got some of the more meaty stuff. So when I work with my clients, they're doing a lot of their own clearance, and they like that because actually that means they can achieve incredible results in a very short amount of time because they're doing stuff and I'm doing stuff. But I do the more meaty, complex stuff that requires the practitioner and the training and the knowledge, whereas they do the stuff that doesn't require that, but under my guidance, which means we're able to get results in a very, very short amount of time. Whereas if they were booking in and having that with me, we'd be weeks at it because they'd have to book in, you know, and that'd be expensive for them. So I much prefer having a way where we're co-clearing and I do the meaty stuff and they're under my guidance, which means we're just getting that. And that's how I get to heal women with tocophobia in 3 weeks, because we're doing a lot in a short amount of time. So, but anyway, we're digressing and I'm noticing the time as well. But it's been a fantastic conversation, Alex. Now, you've talked about Rewind, you've talked about TBR College at the beginning. So if people want to find out more about you and your work, where can they find you online?
So I collect websites like other women.
Oh yes, same here.
So I've got 3 websites, but if you're a perinatal professional, so if you're a doula, a midwife, a health visitor, an antenatal teacher, hypnobirthing teacher, then go to tbrcollege.com. If you are a parent who's experienced any kind of perinatal trauma, then and you want to work with me, then go to thebirthrepublic.com. That's my own therapy website. And if you want to find a practitioner or a therapist near you who's also got a lot of perinatal experience, then go to traumaticbirthrecovery.com, and that's like my listing site for people who have trained with me. So yeah, three different websites.
Brilliant. I love it. I've got those websites too.
Wrong with us.
I know, we're crazy, right? We've probably got a lot of trauma.
Website hoarding. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for joining me today. It's just been brilliant. Thank you so much. And and I hope that those listening have got a little bit of hope. I know, is there anything you just want to finish off? Anything we haven't covered about?
No, not really. I mean, it really stays with me what you're, trying to encourage people to really lean into what their fears are and to use them as a way of growing and developing and evolving and moving. The only thing that the only disclaimer I would say is that there is a different kind of therapy for everyone. So those people who think that it's going to take a long amount of time and that it needs to be honoured and that it's going to be painful and difficult, then they will find a therapist who will provide that. And those who, like you say, the type of therapist you are, and for myself as well, because I'm always really clear about what's involved with working with me or someone I've trained, it attracts people who are like, no, that's for me. And I think that's the thing. It's like, look for somebody who is a match for what you think. Do you know what I mean?
No, I'm glad you said that, because that's really.
If you want to work quickly, then go and find. So if you want to be painful, like I totally respect that, because there's a big part of me that likes to find everything difficult. I like to overcomplicate. I like it, if it's not going to really cost me blood, sweat, and tears, then I'm not really in for it. So I'm like that person who's got like loads of things about things being difficult. So I do appreciate that in people who are seeking therapy that perhaps is longer or more honouring of difficult emotions.
A bit more, I suppose, longer term, a bit slow burn, all of that.
Exactly. Don't be put off. There are still therapies for you. But if I suppose is what I want to say is that there are so many different courses for so many different horses, and there's it's always worth pursuing, because ultimately the most important relationship you'll have in your life is the relationship you have with yourself, and this is what this is all about. No, brilliant. Thank you for that, Alex. It's been brilliant. Thank you so much. You're welcome, Alexia. Lovely to speak to you again. Very jealous of your pool life. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.